Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am Ashley Tellis, a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment, and I want to welcome all of you this afternoon to this event, which we have titled Remembering Subbu. K. Subrahmanyam, as all of you who are in this audience would know, was a larger than life figure in India's national security debates, going back almost 40 years, if not longer. He nurtured a group of intellectuals at the IDSA from the 70s onwards, many of whom now dominate the discussions about Indian national security in New Delhi. And in that sense, he lives on in the individuals whom he nurtured and brought to the fore of public policy. And of course, he was involved in policy making himself. First as a civil servant coming through the ranks of the IAS and working in the Ministry of Defense, then as convener of the National Security Advisory Board, where he left a very distinctive imprint on India's nuclear doctrine, and then as the chair of the Kargil Review Commission and the landmark report that was issued with respect to the reform of Indian intelligence and Indian policymaking with respect to crises. Subbu has passed away, but this is not a memorial service. This is in many ways a celebration because for someone like him, we don't need to mourn the fact that he's gone, we need to celebrate the fact that he lived and that he made contributions very distinctively to India's own security, to its way of life, and in the last years of his life to US India relations. And I will speak about that at some point later this afternoon. So, this is a celebration, it is a reflection on both his life and his work, and it's a conversation among friends who had the privilege of knowing him both personally and professionally. And so, of course, I want to welcome all of you, but I want to take special pleasure in welcoming the panel that we've assembled before you today. Let me start with according a welcome to Her Excellency Ambassador Meera Shankar, India's ambassador in the United States. Welcome back, Meera. It's a pleasure to have you as always. And a very distinguished panel of individuals whom I'm going to briefly simply identify by what they do. To Ambassador Shankar's right is Peter Lavoie, who is the Director for Analysis in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Sorry, to his left. Sorry, to Peter's left. To Peter's left is Neil Jock, who is the National Intelligence Officer for South Asia. To Neil's left is Dhruva Jaishankar, who is here both in his capacity as a budding strategic analyst in the city and as a relative of Subbu. He is Subbu's grandson. And I hope that Dhruva at some point will speak on a personal note as well. And to Dhruva's left is George Perkovich, who is the Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. The batting order and we have Steve, who is virtually with us through the airwaves. In fact, probably the person who has known Subbu the longest, who is joining us from Atlanta. What I propose we do this afternoon is have each of our panelists speak for between 10 and 15 minutes. I'm going to yield the floor very shortly to Ambassador Shankar to lead us off, after which I suggest we go with Steve Cohen next because he has to keep a schedule in connection with the meeting that he's involved in. I'll ask Neil Jock to speak after Steve on Subbu as a public intellectual. Then I will ask Pete Lavoie to speak on Subbu's contributions to intelligence and the role he played in reforming India's intelligence establishment. We will go thereafter to George Perkovich to talk about the nuclear contributions. I will then speak on US-India relations, and I will finally yield the floor to Dhruva to give us a personal reminiscence. So without further ado, thank you very much, Ambassador Shankar.
Thank you, Ashley. We are here, as you said, today to celebrate the life and work of a remarkable individual, K. Subrahmanyam. Subbu, as he was known to his friends, was a father figure to India's strategic community, which he was instrumental in developing and shaping over his many years as director of the Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis and as a prolific strategic commentator throughout his life. Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh has described him as an outstanding public servant, visionary, and thinker who will be missed by the generations who were inspired and influenced by his thoughts. If we look at Subbu's contribution to India and its policies, I think the foremost contribution was in creating a strategic community in a country which was still talking in terms of the idealism of its freedom movement. It looked at the world in terms of high moral principles, no alignment with any blocs, peaceful coexistence, disarmament, world peace. But it was left to Subbu to inject a dose of realism into India's worldview. Subbu himself was keenly shaped by his experience as a young deputy secretary in the Ministry of Defense in the wake of the '62 conflict, in which the lack of attention to hard power had been felt visibly by India. When he came back to India and set up the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, he devoted his entire energy to injecting this element of an appraisal of real power and its importance into India's approach to the world. In fact, he always lamented that a nation which has, as part of its legacy, the writings of Chanakya, had forgotten statecraft in the many years of foreign rule. His initial contribution to the strategic debate in India was after China's nuclear tests in 1964, when he argued for India keeping its nuclear option open and not joining the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It was not a foregone conclusion that India would stay out of the treaty, and there were voices on both sides of the debate. But I think Subrahmanyam's voice proved decisive, and he swung the debate in terms of the strategic necessity for India not to give up its option in view of the environment of nuclear asymmetry that it faced. Subsequently, when India became nuclear in 1998, Subrahmanyam was the voice of reason, and this surprised many within the Indian establishment, because there were voices demanding a far more strident posture by India than eventually emerged. Subrahmanyam, as the convener of the National Security Advisory Board at that time, argued that the policies and postures adopted by both the USA and Russia, or the former Soviet Union, were unrealistic and had no relevance for the Indian situation. He urged a policy of responsibility and restraint by India in terms of the principles of no first use, non-use against non-nuclear weapon states, and a minimum credible deterrent. These principles were adopted and now characterize India's nuclear posture. Subrahmanyam was also instrumental in the setting up of the National Security Council per se. He was the lone voice, I think, which argued very forcefully that the existing instruments of the Foreign Office and the Defense Ministry and the Home Ministry and the intelligence services were not adequate to deal with the complex interlinkages between all these areas in the realm of modern day security. And therefore, for India, a National Security Council was essential to be able to integrate these various elements and to look at national security issues in a holistic way. When the National Security Council was set up in 1998, I think Subrahmanyam was the main person responsible for this. And of course, in a nuclear environment, it is absolutely an essential instrument of state organization. The Kargil Committee report was a major exercise in analyzing what had happened during the Kargil intrusion by Pakistan, and also what remedies were required to strengthen India's national security and to avoid the recurrence of such incidents in future. It's a very comprehensive report, which I had the responsibility to follow from the Ministry of External Affairs when I was dealing with international security. And of course, he always argued that this report should be made public. Of course, it's a confidential document to date. Towards the end of his life, Subrahmanyam became one of the strongest advocates of very strong engagement between India and the United States. He was ahead of the curve in doing so, even though he had been critical of US policies during the Cold War. I think he was quick to grasp that with the end of the Cold War, there were natural factors, natural convergences of interests, which would bring India and the United States together. It was his advocacy of the India-US nuclear deal, which was also instrumental in shaping a national consensus on what proved to be a very, very polarizing debate within the Indian polity. But with Subrahmanyam's credibility, once he was willing to argue in favor of the deal, I think a lot of skeptics were silenced. And to the end, he continued to write about the importance of the India-US relationship and its relevance in the contemporary world. In fact, he argued that India and the United States would have no option but to come together to deal with or provide an alternative to both religious extremism and authoritarianism. I think this was the last great idea that he was propagating before he died. I had the opportunity to work with him as a young Foreign Service officer, and beyond the strength of his ideas, I was struck by how easy he was as a person to deal with. He always welcomed engaging young people, never stood on authority, was willing to have you disagree with him as fiercely as he disagreed with you. And I do recall in one argument saying, I say, Subbu, will you let me get a word in edgeways? And he immediately did, which is something very rare. I think he also was indifferent to position, wealth, creature comforts, and was completely taken up with ideas. Very little time for small talk. I recall, and I've mentioned this in the little piece I've written in Foreign Affairs, that a visiting scholar who asked him, Subbu, what do you do to keep fit? What exercise do you do? He quipped and basically put an end to the conversation by saying, jumping to conclusions.
That's so perfect.
He refused many honors, and that was very characteristic of him. I know personally that when he was retiring, at the age of 60 as director of the IDSA, he was offered to continue in the post because the government felt that it would be difficult to replace him, but he turned it down. And he turned it down out of conviction because, as he said to me, the landscape, the streets of India are strewn with the wreckages of institutions because individuals have come to believe that they are indispensable to the institution. And he said, I have to move on, and that's the biggest favor I can do to the IDSA, that it will become an institution which stands on its own feet. I also recall that he was offered one of the Padma Awards, which is the highest award that the Indian government can give. And at that time, he was a journalist writing for first the Economic Times and the Times of India. And out of conviction again, he turned it down because he said, as a journalist, my credibility will be affected if I accept awards from the government. That, in a sense, captures the essence of Subbu, fierce in ideas and debate, loyal to his friends, democratic in his approach to others, and willing to live by the power of his personal example. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Shankar. I will call on Steve if we can get him either visually or through the audio. Steve, can you hear us?
I can hear you, and we're connected. I'll stay on the line.
Steve, if you don't mind, depending on your commitments at the other end, we are more than happy to let you go now. If you can go through the audio alone, or we can bring you in later on once we reestablish.
The video is very shaky, so I would stick with. Let me say a few words now, and then depart. I think that'd be the best plan.
I think that's fine. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, Ashley asked me to talk about Subrahmanyam as a Ministry of Defense reformer, and that's the role in which I first came to know him. I was a young faculty member back in India in the early 60s, 65, 66, 67. And I was steered on to Subrahmanyam by Sig Harrison, among others, and as a man who was heading up this new Institute of Defense Studies. I think they were in Lajpat Nagar then, or Ring Road. And so he was intensely interested in what I was writing about, which was the transformation of the old British Indian Army. How did Lord Clive's army, the army of the 18th century, wind up as the modern Indian Army? So he worked with me. He talked to me. I'm not sure whether being a Tamil had special interest for him, but we worked together. And eventually, he actually published an article I wrote in the then journal of the IDSA. And I learned afterwards that I was the only foreigner to have been published in the journal. And he jokingly said, "Well, it's okay, Steve. You're not a foreigner." So I was enormously pleased by that, and I've always had an affection for him from that point on. But it was clear, and I think one of the best sources of Subrahmanyam's work in defense management and intelligence is his own writings. And when he does get a good biography, a lot of what he did is actually recounted in his own writings. He did a study of the intelligence failures of 1962. He did that in 63 or 64, and that was a precursor to the Kargil Review Commission. He also was interested in intelligence reform. I know others will speak about that. I visited him once in the Joint Intelligence Committee, and he took me around and showed me the layout and also asked my advice about intelligence analysis. I knew nothing about that. But I think what I learned from him, what I learned about him, was he was not afraid to ask anybody of any age or any experience about information about a subject that was near and dear to his heart, which was defense organization and defense structure. I think that everybody who knew him knows that he was not a saint. It's clear that he angered people, especially people who were not sure of their facts. The fact that he had a photographic memory put him at a great advantage with all of us who were blessed with nothing more than normal. And he could also, in a sense, be abrupt and abrasive. But I think some of the people who followed him had many of his qualities, but with the edges rounded off. But still with the same interest in analysis and getting to the facts. But above all, I saw him in action both at IDSA and elsewhere as an organization man in the best sense of the word. word. He's been called Shankar Gupta referred to him as a member of the establishment. I think that's accurate. He believed that India should have a modern state as efficient and as effective as possible, and he was willing to turn to any source for information about improving the quality of Indian government and bureaucracy. And that was why, when I first met him, he had stacks of RAND Corporation studies at IDSA, and they were running short courses for Indian officials, military and civilian, on the kind of things that RAND did. If you read some of his writings, you'll see he discusses the early origins of IDSA, a toss-up between RAND and IISS, and they eventually went the IISS route, but he still introduced a lot of RAND material into the curriculum at IDSA in the short courses. So I think he was interested in defending the system, but improving the system, making it as good as he could. He also rubbed people the wrong way, even whether he was at IDSA or in the ministry. I know that during the 70 War, he not only famously talked about this being the opportunity of the century to defeat Pakistan, but he also publicly advocated the invasion of Sindh, which drove the foreign ministry crazy. And because he was not in the government then, but he was in IDSA, but he really stretched the boundaries of a government official on deputation to IDSA. But I thought at the time, and I've thought since then, that it showed great courage on his part. I also saw that courage demonstrated when he took into IDSA a number of people who had run afoul of the Indira Gandhi emergency. And he sheltered them, protected them, until he himself was rusticated to the Tamil Nadu Madras Secretariat. And I know I've heard that down in Madras itself, he protected people from the worst excesses of the emergency. So I think, in summary, he was keenly interested in my work because I was interested in the organization of the military, and it protected me in a number of small ways and defended my work to the government. And I'll always be grateful to him. I guess it was November 7th and November 8th. He was very ill, but he came out to IDSA and helped me launch my Army Without Aiming book. He'd written a blurb for it, but again, I think that was a subject that was very close to his heart, near and dear to his heart. And what was astonishing about his chairing the session was that he then turned and cheerfully criticized me and the book, and correctly also. I was scribbling, taking notes on what he was saying. So while he could be critical of you, he was always worth listening to. And I think his memory, to me, that's the most powerful memory I have of Subbu.
Thank you, Steve. If you want to stay on, by all means.
I have a few minutes, and I've got to make a presentation of my own about the book, in fact. Yeah. I can stay on for a couple of minutes.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you. Neil? Whatever you feel comfortable.
Thank you very much for attending. It's good to see a lot of familiar faces here. It feels like a kind of gathering of the tribes, and good to be part of that. Ashley, thank you very much for inviting me to take part. I first met K. Subrahmanyam in January of 1984 when I was beginning my career, and it brings me some sorrow to be close to the end of my career and see him no longer with us. But Ashley asked me to talk about him and my thoughts about Subbu as a public intellectual. So that's what I'll do as I see how he shaped our thinking. He shaped how we think about a whole range of issues: politics, strategy, security, the Indian post-colonial narrative, if you will, India's role in the world, the terms of various debates, a whole range we could all cite. The nature of the public discourse, in effect, was affected by how Subrahmanyam thought. He wrote about issues and brought them into the public forum. In a sense, you could say he was his own sunshine policy, in the sense that he challenged the public to think about issues that were uncomfortable, that were sometimes assumed without being analyzed, that were sometimes taboo. We could think of a number of examples. Let me just cite a few. Non-alignment, for example, and realism. He wouldn't accept the pigeonhole that some would want to put him in, that if you said you were non-aligned, that you did not defend your national security interests. He rejected the identification of non-alignment as an ideology. Instead, he saw it as a rational means of achieving national security objectives. Here we see Subbu as the realist and resisting assumptions about what non-alignment meant. Another example, disarmament and nuclear zero. And here we see the irony in a lot of Subbu's thinking. When India was debating the effects of the CNCI and the 123 agreement on India's right and possible need to test nuclear weapons, he noted with some irony that 4 American former hawks were at that point endorsing the concept of global nuclear zero. Even as he defended India's rights to test, he welcomed these newcomers to the club he argued that had been started with the Rajiv Gandhi plan in 1988. With respect to China, again, he looked beyond common views. He looked behind China's military capabilities, its financial clout, to what he called its knowledge power. And in so doing, he got to the nub of why the US and India are natural allies, even after he criticized the US for its arrogance of power, always balancing these perspectives. He was ready, though, to move beyond tired Cold War rhetoric and see the possibilities of the two countries and their relationship. With respect to Pakistan and the US, while he recognized the importance of the Bush administration's support for CNCI, its emphasis on that, nevertheless he protested what he saw as the Bush administration's unwillingness to do more to stop Pakistani support for terrorism. Again, here, he put his finger on what for some was uncomfortable, not looking away or trying to keep it out of sight. Another couple of examples. With respect to caste, for example, he attacked the inclusion of caste in the Indian census, seeing that as a way to increase vote banks, seeing it as a way to increase divisions in India. He argued instead that every Indian should answer in that column not by caste, but by filling in Indian. Again, a subject that can be uncomfortable, but that he took head on. Also, learning from the past, a stickler for precision, as was cited already. He noted this 1962 decision to request US air assistance before calling on India's own Air Force to perform that mission, and that Nehru did not put out the call for naval assistance. He cared about getting things right, though as was noted, he was sometimes too quick to assume the worst, even when the facts were incomplete. He also railed against secrecy. In this respect, he reminded me of a former colleague, Edward Teller, who lived in the world of secrecy, but at the same time said that we needed to get past it, issuing a plea to open India's archives. The list could go on, but let me end this part of my remembrance with one last example. Here, with respect to the Pakistan government, I would just note that he was skeptical about the displacement of Musharraf as president, where others saw progress. He was cautious about the role that General Kayani would play, looking more to the corporate structure of the Pakistan military. But my point is not to talk so much about that, but to note that there may have been a side to Subbu that we, or at least I, never really saw. One article he wrote about, we could call it Musharraf's retirement from the presidency, was entitled "Same as the Old Boss." Now, those of us who are fans of The Who immediately recognize the line from their famous song, "Don't Get Fooled Again," meet the new boss, same as the old boss. I think I'll leave it to Dhruva to tell us whether or not there was a part to Subbu that appreciated either The Who or rock and roll, but in any case, I think we can agree that in any case, he was not one to get fooled again. By way of conclusion, let me say a few words about an issue that I think opens up an insight to Subbu that I think captures his role as a public intellectual. And in a sense, it comes from an unlikely source, that is how he looked at the bureaucracy and governance. He rejected bureaucratic cant rather than open analysis. He wanted things to be open, not driven by structures. He opposed a kind of mandated mediocrity that would foreclose his words, heroic acts. And I'm going to come back to this notion of heroism in a sec. He rejected a kind of party orthodoxy, as he put it, that would ensure intellectual subservience. Again, defending ideas, trying to have things be out in the open. He wanted to avoid the suffocation of hierarchy that would prevent change and new thinking. He opposed and called out being a useful and efficient tool of leadership, a choice that some in the bureaucracy necessarily make, but one that he thought had to be avoided, going to the final point of the dilemma, the contradiction between conformity and individualism, choosing the latter himself. But as he put it in a particular article, he said this was the ultimate test that allows heroic action. And in one of his writings, he said, when a hero comes along talking about heroism, I think Subbu would be very uncomfortable to be talking about him as if he were a hero. But indeed, that's what I'm doing, using his own words. And in this article, I think you can see to some extent, the writer in the subject. In his own analysis, I think we see some of the points that he would make. He talked about a person with no past and no greed for the future. A person with no past, well, clearly he had a past, but what he was talking about is being an intellectual, living with ideas, not being bound by structure, not being bound by a past, not by having boxed yourself in through a structure that prevents you from being open. And no greed for the future, not saying things to build a future, not hedging your bets intellectually to ensure that you don't step on toes and therefore compromise possible future opportunities. I think, as he wrote about government bureaucrats, indeed we could say he was writing about himself in that respect. A hero was someone who had a stubborn streak and a capacity to resist bullying. In some senses, these are two sides of the same coin, and I think for some, Subbu was a bully, but he was also stubborn in his defense of his ideas. So I think he, again, in writing about others, one can see that there's an element of Subbu in that detail. A refusal to budge to political pressure, someone who would live, as he put it, in splendid autonomy. And I think indeed there was something splendid about his position as a public intellectual in India. Someone who emerged from anonymity to perform, as he put it, the necessary act, and then retreats into obscurity. Again, talking about bureaucratic action that went above and beyond the bureaucracy, above the bureaucratic cant that he resisted, but not for any other purpose than to have the idea survive and not the, not the individual. For him, it was the ideas that mattered. He did not seek personal recognition as a public intellectual, but insisted that it was the ideas that received the full recognition. For him, I believe, that was the necessary act that made him India's dominant public intellectual for over half a century. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Peter, can I ask you?
Okay, Ashley, like Neil, I'd like to thank you for organizing this event. I think it's a fitting tribute, and I think it's probably just one of many that will occur over the next years, in fact, decades, to remember Subbu's great contribution to scholarship, to the world of ideas, and certainly to India's emergence as a great power. I met Subbu, I think, 4 years after Neil met him, first in 1988 when I did some research over there. In fact, I was set up as a scholar in residence, if you will, a young one at IDSA. Subbu had just left as the head of IDSA, as you mentioned. Jasjit Singh was running the institution at the time, but Subbu's presence was very much felt, and he came around quite a bit. It was a great experience. I had this sort of ambitious idea for a PhD dissertation at the time, which I think most PhD students still do have. And Subbu corrected my assumptions about India and the subject I was studying, nuclear proliferation and so forth. And I think even to the last time I saw him, which was just last year, still was correcting my assumptions and ideas about these issues. There was always a lot to learn from Subbu, and he was always generous in imparting that knowledge. Many years after that time when I was there in 1988, one of the young scholars at IDSA, Raja Mohan, who you all know very well, said, you know, let me tell you about those times when you were there. You know, shortly after you got there, the Intelligence Bureau, the IB guys came around and started snooping around, and they wanted daily reports on what you were up to. And we told Subbu this, and Subbu said, chase those rascals out. Next time they come by, chase those rascals out. Ironically, I later did join the intelligence community, but I wasn't. I pledged that I wasn't at that time, but it just is a tribute to his integrity and his interest in scholarship, again, but also his patriotism, but with a very, I think, elevated view of India's position. Subbu certainly was India's Henry Kissinger. I think we've had many Henry Kissingers in the United States, but Henry Kissinger and Brzezinski and everybody else, maybe Ashley tell us, I can put on that list, and everybody else rolled up into one. And I think from the very early part of his career, at least it seems to me, he had a sense of India as a great power in the making and dedicated himself to helping India and India's leaders achieve that vision through the application of the principles of realism. Not always welcome by India's leaders, but certainly he dedicated himself to that. I think, as was commonly the case, and as was pointed out already, wars proved to be the watershed events that shaped his thinking and his understanding of these issues of India's rise and how India would need to relate to its neighbors, in fact, to the other great powers in the world. The 1962 war with China, shaped his views on India military strategy and defense, as Steve Cohen indicated, but also on nuclear weapons, nuclear strategy, which I think George will talk about. The 1971 war was also instrumental in his thinking and certainly shaped his views on how to deal with India's neighbor and the great powers as they affect the region. And then most recently, or more recently, the 1999 conflict in Kargil with Pakistan certainly reinforced his views about India's troublesome neighbor, Pakistan, and particularly shaped his views about how India should conduct its affairs in the nuclear environment. Since the Kargil conflict, which took place, of course, as you know, in the Himalayan heights near the town of Kargil, the Indian town of Kargil, took place just a year after India and Pakistan tested their nuclear weapons in 1998. And so that event, I think, fundamentally transformed his views on what was required to organize, train, and equip the Indian government and military to deal with the challenges of the new regional and security environments under the nuclear shadow. It was indicated that he was asked to chair the Kargil Review Committee by the government of India in July 1999, really just weeks after the hostilities ended in the Kargil Heights. I think it was a very wise choice, and it was a very ambitious choice to select him because, of course, his views and his interests in reforming the national security establishment were well known to the people that chose him for that position. They gave him two tasks. One is to review the events leading up to Pakistan's covert intrusion, and also to recommend such actions as are considered necessary to safeguard national security against such intrusions. It was a pretty big remit, and Subbu didn't fail to take advantage of that opening. His key finding, and we're very sensitive to this in the U.S. intelligence community, whether something is labeled as an intelligence failure or not. In fact, lately we've been hearing this in the press. It's not true. This was not an intelligence failure. I'll go on the record as saying, could we do better? Yes, and we are going to do better in the U.S. intelligence community. But Subbu did declare, and the study's main finding indicated that the Pakistani intrusion came as a complete and total surprise to the Indian government, the army, and the intelligence agencies, as well as to the Jammu and Kashmir state government and its agencies. This was a colossal intelligence failure. But rather than blaming this intelligence failure on any particular individual or organization, as many in the media and some of the participants themselves were prone to do, he cited evidence of a systemic failure of the government as a whole and offered a comprehensive critique of the organization, capacity, and performance of the entire Indian national security and intelligence establishment. For example, this review said, Subbu said, that India's main external intelligence organization, RAW, provided inadequate collection and analysis of the high-altitude border situation. He said that the Director General of Military Intelligence, sort of the chief military intelligence official, that the capacity and performance of DGMI also were totally inadequate, and that there was virtually no coordination between the military and RAW. The group also found that the Intelligence Bureau, the other primary intelligence organization in India, which is dedicated to internal security, that its coverage and its coverage of the situation and its coordination with RAW and the military was also totally lacking. And more generally, the review highlighted the lack of political military intelligence coordination and cited a complete breakdown in the intelligence warning mission. So it was and predictably, this chapter in the committee's report was not published. It was just a little too hard-hitting and a little too honest, even I don't think it's classified. But of course, journalists and others have revealed this information. So, any good review, and with conclusions as strong as that, needs to follow those conclusions with actionable recommendations. And again, Subbu wasn't lacking here. He produced a sweeping list of actionable recommendations that entailed large-scale organizational change, the improvement of capabilities and the dedication of state resources, scarce state resources to capabilities, and major process changes. And I'll cite some of the examples, particularly as they affect the intelligence community in India. First, he called for the creation of a new organization devoted to technical intelligence, particularly technical collection and analysis of intelligence through technical means, modeled loosely on the National Security Agency, if you will, in the United States. And they had a specific name, but now this organization has in fact come up, called NTRO. That was a result of this. More generally, he called for beefing up the technical intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance sort of panoply of actions, including unattended aerial vehicles, UAVs, ground sensors, and other suite of technical tools, which I think are slowly in the making, and India is investing heavily in this area. He also called for the creation of another new organization, a defense intelligence agency, modeled largely on our DIA, but one to integrate all of the service and defense intelligence and to interact and liaise with civilian intelligence organizations and bring them up to military and civilian policymakers. He called for the Intelligence Bureau to be removed from its home in the Home Ministry and instead to become an independent intelligence organization. And he called for the creation of multi-agency centers at the state level in India to fuse intelligence at the state level and to interact with national intelligence organizations, both internal, IB, and external RAW, and the military. Beyond these specific intelligence organization recommendations, he called for appointing a full-time national security advisor, not a dual-hatted position, and more generally incorporating or integrating civilian and military intelligence together and integrating intelligence, civil military intelligence, with the whole range of the national security apparatus in India, including notably bringing the military in this equation, which of course had not been particularly active in the national security decision-making circles before. How did this fare? What were the results of these very strong and I think very appropriate recommendations? I think the answer is that they've only been partially fulfilled. As I mentioned, NTRO and the application of technical means, I think, is a real success that owes credit to Subbu's insight. But if you look at some of the other recommendations, DIA, yes, there is an organization, a Defense Intelligence Agency, but it's not properly funded, it's not properly integrated, and it doesn't have the authority I think it needs to do its job. The head of our DIA would say the same thing, but we actually are in better shape, I think, there. The internal Intel Bureau is still part of the Home Ministry, I believe, and is still subject to some of the other considerations that the Home Minister has. So that vision was not realized at this point. Multi-agency centers, or MACs, were created in India, but they really didn't have a lot of authority. They weren't staffed with, they didn't have enough resources to do their job properly, and they were not well integrated with the other intelligence agencies in the government. A national security agency was established. You have now a full-time NSA, but the staff is still probably a little too small to do the job adequately, although it's moving in that direction. So I think overall the recommendations were exactly spot on, and both Neil and I are now in an organization, Director of National Intelligence, which is trying to complete or take our intel reform to the next level. So we can certainly appreciate the limits and the very practical challenges for moving forward with these reforms. So it's no doubt that Subbu didn't get everything that he wanted, But I think the very tragic attack in Mumbai by Lashkar-e-Taiba proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that each and every one of these recommendations, if they had been acted on fully, probably would have enabled India to anticipate that attack and better prevent and deal with the situation, manage the consequences after the attack. And Mumbai did lead to sort of renewed energy to empower the MACs, to integrate them with IB and RAW, to bring the entire Indian intelligence apparatus together as a community, to bring the military and the civilian side together. But I think it must be said that India still has a long way to go. And unless India is able to fulfill these objectives that Subbu identified and set out in the study, I think this will be a big limit on India's ability to apply power to the challenges it faces in the region and the world. So to wrap up, I think, sadly, it must be said that Subbu, in this case, as in all cases, was very much ahead of his time. Or rather, I think more accurately, he was very much with the time and anticipated things and was very quick to identify things appropriately. But Indian politicians and bureaucrats, of course with notable exceptions, have always been very much several steps back in terms of realizing India's potential. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. George?
So, Peter, the Intelligence Board knew that you were going to go into intelligence when they were worried.
They're that good.
They were
That's
that
right.
so good. They were so
They
good
anticipated.
that they knew before you knew that you were going to do that. Yeah. That's a great story. I want to. I've been asked to talk about Subrahmanyam's views, role in the nuclear debate, and I'm going to do that. And that, but in the first half of what I talk about, and because that was really an extension of the kind of rational realpolitik persona and practice of K. Subrahmanyam, and it was very important, and it's worth talking about. But then at the end, I want to turn to a less frequently discussed part of him, which I think was as important, which has more to do with kind of his passion, and I want to talk about some ways in which that came out, and I think really in a lot of ways animated his great mind. Well, in general, Subrahmanyam wanted India to be sui generis. He didn't, and it is. So there was, from the sense of that it was sui generis, he wanted to project that and for it to remain sui generis. And so to be a great power, but not to be a great power in the terms in which great power was defined after World War II. And to do things in a uniquely Indian way. Now, in that was obviously a moral critique. In fact, it was broader than moral, but it was more than about power critique of the international system, of the behavior of the United States and the Soviet Union, of the dynamic of the Cold War. And that critique in many ways had to focus on nuclear weapons because in many ways nuclear weapons defined the Cold War after World War II. And so the U.S.-Soviet competition had this nuclear overhang. That was often the text of the tension. It was often the material basis of the competition, but it also then kind of became the subtext. And so Subrahmanyam wanted India to be, especially after the Chinese test in '64, as the ambassador talked about, that India would have to be able to participate and have power in a world where nuclear weapons were defining power. Then you had to retain the option to do that and to develop the capability to do that. But at the same time, if you had a critique of that model of power and that model of the world, and that critique included of the use of nuclear weapons and the threat to use nuclear weapons, that could be a difficult thing to reconcile. And Subrahmanyam reconciled it in many ways, and it often seems strange to people kind of trained in thinking about nuclear weapons here. But he, from early on, kind of led the argument within India to acquire at least the capability and the infrastructure to make nuclear weapons. So he led that charge in a minority. Sometimes he was a voice of one, or a group of one, and other times he had more advocates. So he led that charge. He wrote a very revealing set of papers in 1970 called Options for India, in which he laid out in a lot of detail what kind of infrastructure India would need in order to produce a nuclear arsenal, laying out that this is much more complicated than people tend to think. You need much more in terms of infrastructure, in terms of number, in terms of command and control, in terms of intelligence, the whole organic system that you have to develop around nuclear weapons. He described, and he described well and comprehensively in 1970, and said India should be upfront about it, that this is what they were going to need. There should be a political decision to build all of this, to develop all of it. And then he tried to estimate what it would cost, and he basically just borrowed from a French study that you know, in the French experience would be about $5.6 billion over 10 years, and you could have basically what you would need. This was around 1970. I think that number was, all numbers on nuclear weapons historically basically are pulled out of hats or some other place. And aren't worth very much, but at least he put a number out there, and it was a big number, and at the time it was equivalent to India's total defense spending, so that gave you a sense, if you were a reader, of how serious this was going to be, if you're going to do it. And very interestingly, and typically, he said, don't do it if you're not going to be serious. And there is no shortcut. It has to be done this way if you're going to do it. Now, that obviously wasn't the course that the political leadership took, especially then. One of the things that's interesting about it, and Dhruva said this the other day in a slightly different context, is that you could argue that the requirement that Subrahmanyam laid out in 1970, that India really didn't have the capability to fulfill that requirement for perhaps another 30 years. And that so he was way ahead of time, and it was kind of the rational calculation and the design was right, but kind of the engineering or implementation stuff wasn't what he was going to be bothered with. And Dhruva had talked about this in other contexts, how he was a great thinker and he could say what the answer should be, but like making it happen was a detail that others should get to. Dhruva said it better than I just did, but this was true on the nuclear thing too. Is he kind of had it right conceptually and descriptively, but then kind of overlooked a lot of details that Indian prime ministers focused on. So, because they had to deal with representing the complexity of India and solving multiple problems and resource competition, and so there was often this tension that he would have with political leadership because they were dealing in the messy world of real life as opposed to kind of the conceptual world of designing what would be an optimal, from his point of view, whether it's a nuclear capability or national security capability. So he pushed for years and years and ultimately was very influential in bringing about the decision to go open in 1998 and test nuclear weapons and move towards developing an arsenal. And then, as the ambassador said, he stuck to his view that India should be sui generis and that nuclear weapons were not the way that, or should not be thought of and handled the way that the US and the Soviets did, and so on and so forth. So he started to appear to be the dove after 1998. So once the capability came out, and then the question was what to do, and their voices came behind him saying, now let's go, hundreds, thousands, change the doctrine, think about these things in military terms, and Subrahmanyam stayed with his original position, which was, these are political weapons, they're ultimate deterrents, they shouldn't be used first, you don't need to assemble them. And so that also became kind of a fairly unique position that he held on, even as others followed a different logic that was not as sui generis as Subrahmanyam maintained. And I think this was to his credit. It fit his personality to be kind of out there on his own and more enlightened in a sense than whatever was then becoming the conventional wisdom. But I think he was largely right. That leads me, in a sense, to the switch I want to make and talk a little bit about his passions, because for all of the kind of cold-blooded cerebral analysis he could do, and that he did do, he really was morally inspired, or inspired by a moral sensibility. And you could see this in a bunch of ways. I mean, when he would talk about Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the use of atomic weapons, that wasn't in a national security realpolitik vein. In his view, it was evil, and it was unnecessary, and it was slaughter, it was immoral, and he felt it. And he would talk about Vietnam in the same way, and the bombing in Vietnam. And he was very, I think he had this deep sense of morality, right and wrong, and for all of the giant brain he had, this heart, I think, guided him in a lot of ways. And the most revealing thing he ever said to me, and I wrote a little essay about this in this book commemorating his 75th birthday, but it really opened my eyes to a whole bunch of things. And this was in 1992. And he said, we're sitting at a table, just the two of us, and he's kind of like pointing his finger at me. He says, what the world needs is for blacks in America to become 51% of the population. Then you will get rid of your nuclear weapons the next day, just as South Africa has done with theirs. Well, okay, it gave me a lot to think about. But there was this sense of, again, the passion, the sense of justice and structure that really did motivate him. And so when Americans were coming around and trying to speak or preach to Indians about how they should deal with nuclear weapons as if this was, kind of purely mathematical or rational or bean counting, he had a very different sense about what this nuclear order was about. And I still think about that all the time. I find it very informative, and it was bold of him to say it. And so I want to add that to the mix of all the things that we talk about in terms of this rational and analytic point of view, was this deep sense of passion. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, George. I want to offer a few reflections on Subbu and U.S.-India relations. I always had the feeling that I knew Subbu long before I knew him. I knew him for the first time, in a manner of speaking, in the late 1970s, when I was a young man growing up in Bombay, going quite regularly to what was then the USIS, trotting through a series of American visitors, talking to Indian audiences on a range of subjects. And it was fascinating for a young person like myself to hear the stories of these American visitors who had come to Bombay after their first stop in Delhi, completely bloodied by the presentations that they were invited to make at the IDSA, usually on the subject of educating Indians as to why they should not have nuclear weapons. And you had a line of visitors who would end up in Bombay, then describing their experiences in Delhi. And as they conveyed the sense of being confronted by this character called Subrahmanyam, who had a very powerful accent, who had an incredible memory, and a memory that was literally photographic, not simply about his own country, but about the United States and especially its own nuclear history, and confronted his interlocutors with details that they had either not known about or not forgotten conveyed a sense of who this person might be. And so there was a palpable sense of awe, this force of nature called Subrahmanyam, who had slayed many great American academics who in our country were known to be great exponents of nuclear deterrence theory and the like. So I followed these tales about Subrahmanyam for close to a decade, from the 80s, from the late 70s to the mid 80s. But I first met the great Subrahmanyam really in the early 90s. I think it was 1993, 1994. I was working at the RAND Corporation, and I had written a series of pieces before that on Indian defense policy. And it was a chance meeting we finally met. And I found him to be remarkably tame in comparison to the reputation that he seemed to have, and certainly the reputation that I picked up listening to his American interlocutors. And I attributed that in the course of the conversation and the conversations that followed to the fact that I was probably a fellow traveler, that I was a realist. We thought about the world in terms of power. I knew about concepts of national interest, and those things were very intimate. Those things were ideas that came very naturally to Subbu. But I suspect the truth of the matter was somewhat more prosaic. During one of these encounters with Subbu, I one day informed him, again completely on the off chance, that I was a great aficionado of South Indian food. That turned out to be a very happy undoing, because for the next 20 years, literally, Subbu became my guide into appreciating and understanding that there is no such thing called South Indian food. And unfortunately for Mrs. Subrahmanyam, she was press ganged into many of these, the education of Mr. Tellis in South Indian food. And I was introduced by him first to a variety of South Indian cuisines in different parts of Delhi. And it was almost a tutorial. I mean, he selected, every time we went out for lunch, he selected the meals, he selected the items, and I got the full history of the ingredients, of the way the item was cooked, and its significance, religious, cultural, and what have you. And so I suspect it was, the culinary connection more than the political realism that ended up having me forgiven in Subbu's eyes. Because our conversations with him always had a very interesting quality. There was a strong cerebral sense, which all of us who encountered him in different ways encountered. We saw that up front. But there was also a depth of affection, which in his own sort of uncomfortable, shy way, he found an opportunity to express. And it was in the way he treated you. It was in the way he critiqued you. It was never vicious. It was never mean-spirited. But he never let go an argument that he thought was foolish or deserving of correction. In fact, the perennial memory I have of Subbu is someone who was always cerebral, not a respecter of persons in the conventional sense. Who you were really didn't matter, but what you said did. And if you said something wrong, then you certainly were deserving of quick and swift correction, lest the error go unpunished. And so it continued. I got to know Subbu very, very closely in the 3 years that I was in Delhi from 2001 to 2003. By that time, Subbu had changed, at least in terms of his core beliefs about Indian national security, with respect to the United States and with respect to the great powers. And by 2001, he had become a strong champion of the US-India relationship. And one of the things that I did in the embassy was I invited him on several occasions, and this was a risky enterprise, to Ambassador Bob Blackwell's roundtables. And it was a risky enterprise because Subbu was a character and so was Bob. And I was never quite sure what the chemistry between the two would be. And I will just say that there were several occasions in which it was touch and go. But it is both to Subbu's credit and to Bob's credit that they realized the benefit each had for the other. And I can't speak for Subbu, but I can say some things for Bob because I worked for him. Bob realized very quickly that this was truly the smartest guy in the room and that it was important to have him. One, because it had a leavening effect on the quality of the debate. Two, because it was extremely important for our American visitors, for whom the roundtables were usually hosted, to hear what was an authentically Indian voice. And Subbu was both authentic and articulate. And three, Bob, with a very fine political nose, realized that Subbu would actually be a very important ally in the work that he was trying to do in forging the relationship. And I think that calculation paid off handsomely. Subbu, throughout the decade, the first decade of the new century, became the strongest champion of US-India relations. In the second term of the Bush administration, he actually played, and one day when I write the history of this, I will elaborate this more clearly, but he played a cameo role at the time when the nuclear deal was being negotiated between July 14th and July 18th. And after the agreement was finally reached and implemented, he played a tripartite role. He played a role which involved defending the agreement and articulating its benefits in the public sphere at a time when, as Ambassador Shankar pointed out, there was great polarization, including many of his own friends who felt that this was going to bind India and constrain India. He very importantly worked within the government of India, unseen from the public eye, to shore up support on the part of important personalities who, shall we say, were wobbly at a time when Prime Minister Singh needed all the help he can get. And third, he was an active co-conspirator with me and with others in helping us trying to figure out the best way to sell the relationship. For those of you who followed the debates around the nuclear agreement, you recognize clearly that we had a very difficult act to pull off. And the difficulty fundamentally arose from the fact that the arguments that were essentially appealing to the Indians were the arguments that got us into trouble in the United States. And the arguments that were appealing in the United States got us in trouble with India. And I have literally dozens of emails that Subbu and I exchanged during those years about how best to position our public policies in a way that would command that narrow middle ground and allow us to sell the nuclear agreement both in Washington as successfully as we did in New Delhi. But his contribution to US-India relations goes beyond the nuclear agreement, although the nuclear agreement provided the opportunity for him to articulate many of the arguments that he made. For him, the nuclear agreement was important because it allowed India to break the bonds of what he famously called nuclear apartheid. But more importantly, because he saw it as the way to remove the albatross that had laid around the relationship. And he saw this as in a sense, new beginnings. But the beginnings to what ends? And I want to spend a few minutes just talking about that, because that goes beyond the nuclear agreement per se, and it also ties with the theme that George flagged, which is often missed, which is Subbu's normative view of the world that goes beyond just the brute sense of politics. Let me advance three propositions. I think Subbu deeply believed that the United States and India were fated to become strategic partners. In the first instance, because we shared common threats. And these common threats were not simply threats at the international level. I mean, everyone gravitates to those and understands those. but they were common threats at a civilizational level, at an existential level, in the way in which our societies are ordered. And it was that moral dimension that always suffused his arguments. And you had to discern that moral patina essentially by reading between the lines or seeing him in person. Because when the arguments were expressed, they were always expressed in the cold calculus of national interest. But once he made that transition and saw that the United States and India had common links, he then became the champion of those links, tried to explicate them, tried to get his own countrymen to see the value of deepening these links and the value that it would have for India. My second proposition would be that he did not just see our two countries as being fated to become partners, but he actually thought it was desirable that this partnership obtain. And again, desirable not simply because of the interests, but fundamentally because of the values. He believed that. It was not simply an act. And the interests only reinforced that in virtuous ways. And the interests for him were that the ties with the United States would ultimately accelerate India's own rise. In that sense, he was quintessentially a nationalist. And so he was a complex nationalist. He saw the instrumental advantage to be derived from the partnership with the United States. But he also saw the strong congruence and the benefits that arrive from that congruence for both countries. In fact, in the last years of his life, I think he went beyond partnership to describe a relationship that I think can only be captured by the word symbiosis, where he saw the presence of the Indian American community in the United States. He saw the fact that India was becoming more cosmopolitan and open to new ideas, in fact, new people coming to India as a result of economic liberalization, as really the opportunity for both the United States and India to strengthen each other. And there were things that he would say privately and in writing about the importance of US leadership and the importance that the US play the role that its power gives it the privilege of playing. But again, it was, I'm always reminded of a term that recurs frequently in Machiavelli, which is the phrase well used. It's always American leadership well used, or American power well used, because he saw that as being both valuable in itself, but also valuable for India, because to the degree that the United States remained resilient and strong, it provided a buffer from which India's own security could be protected. And for him, economic interdependence between the two countries really became the key. And he began to become more and more ambitious in his vision for what the partnership entailed. And in the last year of his life, he wrote several pieces where he talked about India now becoming the instrument by which the United States could recover its own competitiveness economically and use the strength deriving from that recovered competitiveness to protect its position in the world, thereby advancing its own interests and in the process advancing India's as well. And so this is a remarkable coming full circle of an individual who at one time, after 1971 and its aftermath, became the strongest defender of the Indo-Soviet treaty. And you ask yourself, what explains the logic of someone who 30 years earlier was the great defender and the great champion of the Indo-Soviet peace treaty, now becoming just equally and fervently a champion of the US-India relationship? And I think there's only one explanation that makes sense to me, and that was he took his bearings from what he thought India's national interests demanded. And when he believed that India's national interests demanded a closer relationship with the Soviet Union or any other, he was happy to jump from the ramparts and do battle to defend that idea. And when he realized after the end of the Cold War that there was, in essence, only one game in town, and that India could leverage this last superpower to advance its own interests while contributing to the building of an international order that protected a certain set of values, Subbu saw absolutely no intellectual contradiction in making that leap. And I think when one thinks about Subbu's realism, one, this is a story about Subbu's realism. But the point that I want to emphasize is the point that George left off on, which is it's a very complex realism. Because at home, Subbu was a nationalist, but a cosmopolitan nationalist. He was someone who had deeply imbibed the Nehruvian vision of what India was meant to be: democratic, liberal, secular. And abroad, it was a cosmopolitan internationalism. And so in his way of looking at the world, India's rise meant that it would take its place among the great powers. And that with a certain give and take, it would be possible to put in place something that resembled a concert. And there would always be power differentials among this concert. But recognizing that others ought to be accommodated in this global system was a very important part of his vision. And others like Jasjit Singh and Raja Mohan then ran with the kernel of this idea. So the realism was tempered essentially by a set of values that I think any one of us in this room could feel very comfortable with. And I think the last thing to say is that India will miss him and the kind of vision that he articulated. His very dear friend, who is now the governor of the state of Jammu and Kashmir, Narendra Vora, who at one time was India's defense secretary, a few months ago, in a private conversation we were discussing about Subbu, said, they don't make them like him anymore. And I think that is a fitting epitaph to the person that we have been talking about this afternoon. I will miss him greatly as a friend. Thank you. Ruba? Absolutely. Sure.
Thank you. On behalf of my family, some of whom are here in the audience today, I'd like to thank the Carnegie Endowment for putting together this wonderful event. And I'd especially like to thank Ashley for not just pulling this together, but bringing together a remarkable lineup of speakers, and also for inviting me to say a few words here that will hopefully try and link a case of Subrahmanyam's personal and professional lives together. For a recognizable public intellectual who wrote frequently in the print media and appeared regularly first on radio and then on television, my grandfather was not a public personality. Many who worked closely with him over the years knew surprisingly little about his personal life. He grew up in the 1930s and 1940s in a small-town provincial Madras, today's Tamil Nadu. But he developed a keen interest in military affairs during World War II when he was a teenager. He would follow the war daily in English language newspapers and radio broadcasts, which he would imbibe at a local restaurant, as his own home didn't have electricity, let alone a radio. His ambition for a while was to join the military, but he ended up going to Madras University to study chemistry and then sat for the All India Civil Services examination, entering the Indian Administrative Services as a career civil servant. By the 1960s, he was a junior officer in the Defense Ministry, and some people have touched upon how the 1962 war and then the 1964 Chinese nuclear test affected him. But I would actually like to draw attention to another episode, which was the 1965 war with Pakistan. At that time, he was a relatively junior officer, and he had this demonstrated enthusiasm for military affairs. And this sort of I guess his enthusiasm for India being prepared and for India's defense planning caught the attention of the defense minister at the time. And his standing appears to have grown within the decision-making circles of the period when his repeated calls for an extra armored division to balance Pakistan's were ignored. And Indian military planners only realized this lack of preparedness in 1965 during the war with Pakistan. This was followed shortly after by a year-long tenure as a Rockefeller Fellow at the London School of Economics, for which he was recruited by Alistair Buchan of IISS. He was also heavily influenced by a lengthy visit he made in the 1960s to the United States, both the East and West Coasts, where he met most of the big names in American strategic thinking of that era and became familiar with the works of many others, Wohlstetter, Kissinger, Brodie, Schelling. It led one non-proliferation expert to recently remark that we have Harvard to blame for India's nuclear bomb, but I think Rand probably deserves equal credit. I bring these episodes up because one of the things that's striking about this sort of short biography is that his early influences were distinct by the absence of anything related to the Soviet Union. All his formative experiences were really either British or, in fact, American. And even though he became much associated as a pro-Soviet figure in Washington during the Cold War, one of his favorite anecdotes from the early 1980s involved a meeting he had at the Ministry of Defense when he was working there with an American official who is not here, actually, who remarked at the time, "So where do the Russians sit?" So India's orientation, he felt, was much like his own, and grossly misunderstood by most Americans. His professional contributions have been very well documented here today, but I have a few thoughts on some other aspects. First was his willingness to mentor a wide range of budding scholars while at IDSA, and Ambassador Shankar mentioned that. And this was really, in hindsight, quite remarkable. Individuals who consider themselves his protégés range in age from their 70s to their 20s, which means, in effect, that he had half a century's direct impact on Indian strategic thinking. For a career bureaucrat, he had a remarkable amount of disdain for conventional notions of seniority and rank. He cared little about people's qualifications or past credentials, and perhaps some of this arose out of his own lack of conventional training in strategic affairs. He found that Indians paid much more attention to this than their Western counterparts, although he was prevented from teaching at Jawaharlal Nehru University, India's most prominent academy of international affairs, on the grounds that he lacked a PhD in a related field. He was appointed a professor at Cambridge by a man who incidentally disagreed with him on most matters of scholarship. My grandfather's nonpartisanship was another remarkable trait, and his refusal to seek out political patronage and his disgust with the more brutish side of Indian politics. This became apparent in his later writings. But, this both broadened his influence across governments, but limited his ability to become too closely involved in the implementation, as George Perkovich mentioned earlier today. I actually, as other people were speaking, I was scribbling down a few other disparate anecdotes and episodes, and I thought I'd share some of them with you. One was he had these strong, almost visceral reactions to certain episodes in his own experience. He once said that the sort of happiest he ever was one in 1971, when India won the Bangladesh War, and again in 1998 when he felt very honored to be not once but twice, in fact, the first person outside of government to be informed of India's nuclear test. The then Vice President Krishan called him up from Egypt, where he was on a visit, to tell him that India had successfully tested a nuclear device. And a few minutes later, Jaswant Singh, then the foreign minister, called him up to tell him the same thing, thinking he did not know. The sweetest moment he ever described was, in his memory, was listening to a radio broadcast on August 15, 1947, so at the dawn of Indian independence. And this actually speaks a lot about his own sense of nationalism. And then the low point, actually, was in 1962, when he came into his office and found his office mate in tears because he had seen a letter that Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru had sent to President Kennedy about requesting American help for the war against China. People spoke about some of his other the other issues that he sort of campaigned towards. One was actually a sort of habit of action and habit of thinking in India, which he felt was severely lacking. Among the other recommendations of the Kargil Review Committee was really regularized meetings of the Cabinet Ministry on Affairs of National Security, and he felt that really a lot was being conducted in an ad hoc manner, really where meetings were only taking place during crises. Another proud moment that I forgot to mention, he was quite pleased to learn that a Pakistani military academy had a course on Hindu strategic thought from Chanakya to Subrahmanyam, and he felt that this was the highest compliment that he could be given.
That's good.
Ashley spoke very eloquently about his thoughts on the inevitability of the U.S.-India relations, as did Ambassador Shankar, and I actually believe, having worked with him in the last 5 years on some of that his latest contributions may yet be his most important. A brief thing about his sort of strange relationship with pop culture, or the lack thereof. I mean, I'm not sure if he was a fan of The Who. One of the more bizarre and slightly embarrassing episodes I had with him was when I was living and working with him in 2006, and I was early one morning. I was getting up to go to work, and he'd already been up for a few hours reading the newspapers and digesting a whole range of news. And this is what happens when YouTube becomes a newsworthy item, because he asked me, sort of looked at me across the table and sort of very seriously, and he said, "Tell me, what is pole dancing?" This is not a subject I really want to get into with my grandfather, but he'd read somewhere about some video that had become a big political scandal about somebody looking dressed up as Mahatma Gandhi doing said dance. Another thing that he focused on ideas, and I mean part of what made him so effective was his ability to focus on these ideas and really give them life. And one that he adopted, I think perhaps from his meeting from Schelling with Schelling in the 60s, was salami slicing. And I always thought he frequently used this term, and I always thought it was quite interesting because it was something his Tamil Brahmin forebearers would probably have looked down upon. One of the things I find quite remarkable about him, particularly in a U.S. context, is his work is really the differing levels of appreciation of his work. You have some people writing about India who are heavily influenced, obviously, by their interactions with him, either personally or through his writings. And in some remarkable cases, you have entire books written on Indian strategic thought and Indian foreign policy, which make no mention either of him or his ideas. And I always think that that's actually a good barometer of how good a book is on the subject. If you could look at the footnotes and see how many references there are to him. Although he influenced a lot of people very positively, a remarkable number of people, and you can see this in the number of the amount of writing and number of events that have been held, 2 in Washington already that have been held for him. He also did make a lot of enemies, and people made these sort of rather cynical charges that he was a paid agent, which would be remarkable for anybody who actually visited him and saw that he worked without a secretary alone. He didn't have an institutional affiliation. He didn't have any of the trappings that somebody of his stature would normally have been accorded. Some people accused him of apostasy, and his defense, as people have already argued, is that he stood in the same place while the rest of the world changed around him. People accused him of being anti-academic, and I always found this rather interesting because he he didn't need, he always thought outside the box because he never had a box to begin with. And he actually was not, I mean, in some ways his greatest benefit was that he didn't actually have, he was able to reconcile a lot of these very contradictory ideas, what things would be realism and idealism, nationalism, internationalism. He didn't see these necessarily as contradictory. Those are just so a few other funny anecdotes. One was because of his hawkish reputation, it led to some interesting descriptions of him. One of the best being in the New Yorker, where Amitav Ghosh, I believe, was writing an article on India's nuclear evolution and described him as a big booming man, and he wasn't really, yeah, he wasn't. I mean, neither particularly big nor booming, although he had a presence. And another personal anecdote was related to the one that George mentioned. Was one of my first experiences of seeing him in action was at a session involving Hans Blix, the nuclear weapons inspector, who was doing the usual lecture to why India must disarm and all of that. And this was at the India International Center in Delhi, and at some stage, I'd seen him speak about this before, so I knew he had very strong views, and some things would set him off. One of the best being South Africa, South Africa's nuclear weapons, and Hans Blix was listing all these countries. Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons, and then as soon as he mentioned South Africa, I was sitting and I said, "Oh no, don't, please don't do that." And of course, even though he was supposed to wait until the end of Hans Blix's presentation to give a response, my grandfather jumped in and proceeded to tear him apart. Anyway, so those are just a few thoughts that came to me while I was hearing other people speak. I honestly think that much more than his ideas, it was these personal traits, his generosity, his intellectual malleability, and his ability to invest this sort of effort and time in people that really set him apart from a lot of other people in his field, and they make him very difficult to replace. And for those reasons, he deserves to be emulated. Thank you.
All of us at this table have been very privileged to have known Subbu while he lived, which is why we have ended up this afternoon spending some time with you. If this was a normal Carnegie Endowment event, this would be followed with the customary question and answers. I think I will dispense with that on this occasion because it's not appropriate. But I want to thank in a special way Dhruva for taking the time to share those personal reminiscences of his grandfather with us. I have to tell you, it's not just Subbu who lives on through Dhruva, but he has many sons, at least one of whom is in the Indian diplomatic service that I know of. And during the civil nuclear negotiations, it was actually quite at times a surreal experience where we were working with Subbu outside the governmental system and having to negotiate with Subbu's son, Subrahmanyam Shankar, who was the head of the Indian delegation, negotiating the implementation of the civilian nuclear deal. And of course, Sanjay Subrahmanyam is a historian, and the new generation is really present at this table. So we are grateful that we've been privileged to know someone like him. I also want to take the time to thank Ambassador Shankar for coming. She actually flew in from Atlanta this afternoon and had to cut short what would have been otherwise a longer trip to be with us. So thank you very much, Ambassador Shankar. And to both my friends and colleagues from the US government, Pete Lavoy and Neil Jock, for squeezing time from what are usually wretched schedules to come here this afternoon. And of course, my old co-conspirator, George. And to all of you, thank you for coming. I look forward to seeing you.